Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to see everyone here for today's presentation. Just a couple of things before we get started. I want to give a special kind of shout out to our Children's Coordinating Council and to our Transitional Age Youth Planning Project. For those who don't know, the Children's Coordinating Council has been around since about 1995 and is really meant to provide an opportunity to provide coordinated services to increase the effectiveness of all the services that we provide to children in Johnson County. And certainly the Transitional Age Youth Planning Project focuses on adolescents with the goal of really making sure that all of our young folks in Johnson County are able to transition to adulthood successfully. So there's quite a bit of overlap for these two groups. And this topic is something that has come up in both of our groups. And so I think it's going to be of interest when we think about, some of our goals in terms of making sure that all of our kids in Johnson County are able to transition to adulthood successfully. Just very quickly, I'll go ahead and introduce Kevin. Kevin is our program manager with the Adolescent Center for Treatment and the team leader for the Adolescent Outpatient and Addiction Services team at Johnson County Mental Health. He graduated from the University of Kansas with a bachelor's degree in psychology and from UMKC with a master's degree in counseling and guidance. Kevin dual clinical licensure, both in behavioral health counseling and substance use disorder counseling. He serves on the governor's subcommittee on children's continuum of care for the state of Kansas, as well as an advisory board member for the Olathe Communities That Care Coalition and the Johnson County Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kevin. If you guys have questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat and I'll be monitoring those and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Please also, if you could make sure that you are muted, that would help us out as well. Thank you. Over to you, Kevin.
Happy Dorothy.
All right, thank you, Christy. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Kufelt with Johnson County Mental Health and was asked to come give a presentation for you all today on some of the adolescent drug use trends we see in Johnson County. And so I'm going to attempt to share my screen here real quick with everybody. And that way we can kind of get started on the presentation. And so my hope is that everyone is seeing my first slide here. So before we get started here, so we got some people jumping in there. Christy's going to monitor the chat box. So if you have questions that you would like to ask, make sure you put those in the chat box and we will address those towards the end of the presentation. So, but it is my pleasure to be here with you today. And I know Christy kind of rambled off all of my roles with Johnson County Mental Health, both as the program director at ACT, as well as the program manager with the Adolescent Outpatient Addiction Services. So you have my direct phone number there on the slide, as well as my email address. So if you ever have any questions that you'd just like to send me a quick call or an email, I'd be happy to take that from you and provide you with any assistance. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start off by taking you back to 1994. And this was the introduction of the information superhighway. So as we come to know it as the internet. So we'll take a quick little view of this video here.
There will be a road that will not connect 2 points. It will connect all points. Its speed limit will be the speed of light. It will not go from here to there. There will be no more there. There will be no more there. We will all only be here.
Okay, so now you might be asking yourself a couple questions, but really what does this have to do with adolescent substance use? And the answer to that question is really nothing. However, I do have a point I want to make here, and it'll take me a second to get there. But when the internet was first introduced to society, into families, into schools, there were a whole lot of unknowns with what the internet really was going to be. And as the commercial points out, information will be at your fingertips, and you have it at the speed of light, which technically back then was dial-up and would take a long time compared to nowadays speeds. But we no longer had to go to the library for information. People could now sit down at their home computer. They could search for information at their own disposal. And this was obviously a very fantastic new invention and a tool that we were all going to jump on as relatively as quickly as we could. However, there were some moral and some ethical requirements that ultimately they had to train people on how to use the internet safely. So what they identified was the first bit of advice was that when they were talking to the users, they said, don't share your personal information online. And this includes your home phone number. Now, this was back in what, 1996, 1997, and we didn't have a lot of cell phones available. And so they also talked about not giving out your home address, not giving out your social security number, not giving people your birthday. So all this private information that they were, warning folks against, sharing too much over on the internet. The next bit of advice was not to meet up with someone in real life. So you might meet somebody online in a chat room, and you shouldn't meet that person in real life. This is obviously a safety concern that anybody could pretend to be anybody online, and you don't know if that person is out on bail or a convicted felon or just a scary person in general. So at the same time that many of us were learning about these safety precautions, many of us grew up with adults in our lives that pretty much told us about universal safety measures, not taking candy from strangers, not getting into a car with someone you don't know. So just some common sense stuff that we all were pretty familiar with when we were growing up in society. So now we fast forward, or I guess we go back to the future. And so 1994 has come and gone. Now everyone and their dog has a cell phone. And in fact, some of you are probably on your cell phone now watching this presentation. But so it's 2021 now, and most of us have, the Uber and the Lyft apps on our phone. And what's great about these apps is that if you need to get a ride someplace, you just pull out your phone, you log on, and magically someone, meaning somebody that you don't know, is either driving nearby or within a close proximity of where you are. And they will come to your home because you gave them your name and your phone number and your address. And they will pick you up. And let's say they're taking you to the airport. And while driving into the airport, I know you're having some small talk with them, and you're telling them that you're traveling back home to see family for the weekend. And so not only does the driver now know that you're leaving for the weekend by an airplane, so you're leaving the state, they know where you live, and they know that the likelihood of your home being empty is pretty good as well. So despite all those efforts we put forth into training society and people on being careful and being cautious and avoiding potentially harmful behaviors on the internet, here we are. So we all have these this technology in our pocket that allows us to do things that we were warned against doing back in 1996. So, we talk about substance use, and we know that there are several, like millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of journal articles that have been attributed to looking at the harmful impact of smoking, vaping, heavy alcohol consumption, prescription drug abuse. We've looked at mental health and substance use, oral and prescription drug abuse. We looked at how mental health is impacted by substance use. We looked at homelessness and suicidal ideation. We look at divorce and job loss, and all these studies have been done to look at not only the lasting impact that drugs and alcohol have on a person, but also on others in society as a whole. But society continues to engage in these high-risk behaviors, and we continue to push the limits, and we're out there seeking out high-potency drugs. We're looking for shortcuts to finding wealth and happiness. And over the past few years, a lot of time and energy has been put into debunking what is considered a harmful drug versus not as bad of a drug. And as more and more states look to work and legalize different drugs, whether or not those drugs should be rescheduled or reclassified as medicine, and then also some of the recent debates on whether or not vaporizing a drug is healthier for a user. So we take a closer look at all these changes that have occurred in substance use over the past couple of years. There's a push to destigmatize using one drug rather than another, but we should be looking to destigmatize getting help and getting support for things. Now, if I did have to look at a silver lining to COVID,
Hey, Nikki, how are you?
I would say
good,
that
thank
with
you.
COVID, we are
I'm
able to
gonna
kind of look at
start
the amount of.
holiday support, and I wasn't
Okay.
sure. Do you want me just to
Hey
make a
guys,
list
could
of
we
those
all
things and you
please
put
make
in a
sure that
beautiful
our
thing,
mics are
or
muted?
what were you looking for?
Okay. Okay. So with COVID, as I was saying, there's been a lot more attention paid to substance use treatment and mental health supports and services. So I would say that we've had to be, locked out of
Mr.
our
Rim.
offices and not been able to access all the things we wanted to access for the past few years, but we are able to get a better understanding of substance use and mental health support services that are available in our home community. So one thing that I'd like to take a closer look at as well as we talk about, some of the vaping issues and marijuana issues and all these drug issues in adolescents in Johnson County is that we continue to see the average age of first use to drop lower and lower. Now, when we talk about age of first use with Kansas youth, we're primarily talking about age of first use in which they're using some type of mind altering or mood altering substance. And right now in Kansas, it's at about 12 and a half, almost 13 years of age for that age of first use. So we're talking middle school kids. We're talking 12 and 13-year-olds who are taking that first hit, taking that first drink. And so a lot more attention needs to be paid to what can we be doing not only as mental health and substance use professionals, but also individuals in the schools and the faith communities and just concerned parents all around. So we know that some of the common risk factors associated with substance use, there really are 5 that are most frequently associated when we talk about developmental, environmental, social, genetic, and individuals with co-occurring mental health diagnoses. So looking at our pictures here, we can see some obvious connections. So you see the small child there covering her ears as she witnesses frequent arguments in the home. The trauma that she's exposed to, whether it be emotional or physical, contributes to her development and how she manages her own moods and her own behaviors. And oftentimes in treatment, we hear about these kids who are using drugs to self-medicate their problems. So whether they're talking about their past physical or emotional trauma or their depression or anxiety, they often report that being high or being messed up or blitzed out of their mind is sometimes just easier than having to really deal with the problems that they're having. So, but I'm sure, many of you can guess using drugs to cope with these problems just makes the problem, even that much more worse. And oftentimes the consequences of using drugs starts to make their life even that much more unbearable. So many of you here today are in the area school districts. I see a lot of familiar names on there today. And we all know that schools serve as so many roles in these kids' lives. And you all see firsthand that kids are engaging in these high-risk behaviors. You see the high-risk relationships. You see them struggling with their academics. And you know that they're using drugs and just not always knowing exactly what to do for them. But, drugs and alcohol truly become an escape for these kids. And I educate others about the 3 main reasons why users tend to use drugs. That's really to escape, relax, and to reward themselves. So to escape is really that main objective. They will tell you that they don't have to think, they don't have to feel, they don't have to feel anything when they're high. So they'll tell you that my problems seem to go away. I feel so much better when I'm than the person I think that I am. And so we see that, we see another picture here, the young lady in the right there, sitting on a couch in the back alley. And these individuals are often exposed to a world of drugs and violence and crime. And too often now we're hearing about sex trafficking and young girls being plucked from the streets. They're entered into a life of drug abuse and high-risk sexual encounters. And so these numbers are just astonishing and scary with regards to the number of girls being trafficked in the state of Kansas. And I can tell you that we get them in treatment as well at ACT. We hear about their stories of these young girls, and it just saddens your heart. We see these teenagers that come to us that have been pulled from the streets, pulled from their homes. They've been fed all these drugs and alcohol, and they're put into a lifestyle that is just harmful, and not only emotionally, but also just from a trauma perspective. Another picture we see here, we talk about that social piece, and we see some teenagers at a party glorifying the binge drinking behaviors of alcohol. And as many of you know, the rate at which teens experience blackouts and alcohol poisoning is so high due to the high dosages of alcohol that they consume in just one sitting. Every year we hear about local parents being arrested or charged for social hosting parties in their homes, whether that's during homecoming or prom, or even during graduation time from high school. And the message that's really being sent to these kids and their friends is that in my home, I would condone alcohol use. So at some level, the parent is thinking that they're keeping the kids safe by providing, like a safe haven or a place for them to drink responsibly. But really, it's just setting the kids up for, identifying a place that they can go and get drunk and get high too. So too many kids over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen driving under the influence. I know that for a long time, we had like this strain of kids in Blue Valley and those back roads getting into accidents and losing their life due to alcohol use and drunk driving too. So lots of scary, behaviors of kids who are under the influence of alcohol and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. The next picture here, you see a picture of the Osborne family, and we know from that substance use can often trickle down from generation to generation. It's important to educate not only family members and kids of the impact that alcohol and drug use can have on families in different generations, but how it's passed down from whether the grandparents to the parents and to the kids. In many cases, I see them coming to treatment, and what's really been kind of a sad situation is we're now getting the children of former clients. So clients that were in ACT 20, almost 30 years ago, we're now getting their children, and they've kind of continued in that lifestyle. And lastly, when we talk about co-occurring mental health disorders and the risk factors, we see the picture of the young lady holding up a card with a smile on it. And we all know that there's likely not a smile behind that card. And we know that the prevalence of mental health problems are often commingled with addiction, and that the two feed off into each other. And we understand more and more about the complexity of treating both disorders. We know that these are, risk factors, and they're often not singular in many cases, and that most individuals will fall under a variety of different categories. So in many cases, it's the collaboration between the mental health providers, the medical providers, the schools, the families, faith-based organizations, and anyone that has their hand in the mix here, just coming together and doing what we can to provide support and guidance for these kids who obviously have jumped into a world of drug abuse that is often hard to get out of. Okay, so take a look at the substance use in the adolescent brain. So there's numerous websites that show the brain scan imaging of what I guess a normal brain would look like, and what active use looks like on those brains in recovery. But what's important to note with a lot of those brain scan images is that they're showing kind of those physical changes in brain activity. So it's not necessarily that there's been a deterioration of the brain, but really it's more of what's happening in the brain. And those major areas that are responsible for judgment and decision-making, learning and memory and behavior control. So as many of you know, adolescents in particular are very impulsive by nature. And as their brain is still developing, they tend to engage in higher risk behaviors. And I'm sure many of you know that, the human brain, it develops from the back to the front and from the inside out. And it's that prefrontal lobe area that is really the last area to develop. But it's an important area because it's also responsible for a lot of that executive and cognitive functioning. And because of that later development of the frontal lobes, there's a psychologist, his name is David Walsh. He describes the human brain or the adolescent brain as a fully functional car with an accelerator, but the brakes haven't been installed yet. So as the brain continues to develop, we see how their decision-making skills start to improve over time. But I can also tell you that I get kids that come in through treatment that may have started around the age of 12, 13 years of age, and they really act like a 12 or 13-year-old. So despite being maybe 17 years of age. So we see how the brain gets impacted by early onset of substance use. So there is a process known in the brain is called sculpting, or I guess it's also called pruning. This takes place around the age of 11 and 12. And during this pruning process, it's when the connections between brain cells that are not frequently used, they're essentially eliminated from the brain. So pruning it's a healthy process because it clears out some of those unused wiring that takes up space in the brain, but it's also pruning helps the brain to build longer chains of nerve cells. And during this, adulthood, you'll start to see more complex decision-making. So that's where that brain starts to mature over time. And the pruning process is similar to kind of like if you accrue annual vacation time at work, it's kind of one of those use it or lose it types of mentalities. So it's in these changes in the brain that helps explain why a user acts so compulsively and why they continue to use despite some of those negative consequences in their lives. So, when completing assessments, I often evaluate kids and some of the decisions and the choices that they've been making and some of the poor judgments in their social circle of peers, the behaviors they engage in. And they often report that their short and long-term memories are so impaired that they easily forget court dates, project deadlines, homework assignments. They miss appointments, and they often it kind of becomes the norm for them. They just forget all these things that they need, some of these responsibilities in their life. My staff are constantly calling them, reminding them of meeting times and places. And one of the areas that we're often discussing with kids is, that art of forward thinking. It's the, not always living in the here and now, rather, how are my actions? How are my decisions? How are they going to impact my future? And what goals do I have for myself? So as we look at the human brain, the adolescent developing brain, we truly see the negative impact that substance use has on them. For a while, we were seeing that some of the early onset of substance use with kids was the use of inhalants, whether they were using air duster or spray paint or Axe body spray. And you really see this delineation, this negative impact on their thinking and on their brain development, just basically because of that loss of oxygen to the brain was really a negative impact for them. So let's start talking about some drugs. And today's presentation, we've kind of taken a closer look at some of the drugs of choice of adolescents in Kansas, but primarily Johnson County. And the slide here shows a whole wide variety of different substances. If you look at the top left corner, you got a baggie of crystal meth, and then you got some examples of some vape devices. The picture with the dollar bill and the powder is your standard cocaine lines. You got your alcohol. The top right corner there, those are blotters of LSD, the little blotter tabs. And below that is the M30 pills. And a lot of you have probably been hearing more and more about fentanyl and Percocets, these counterfeit Percocets. So M30 is a pretty popular drug right now in Johnson County with regards to fentanyl use. That middle picture there is a picture of a cart or a THC cart. And then to the left of the cart, you have those pink pills. Those are Ambiens. And below that, you have gabapentin. And below the gabapentin, you have Xanax. And then to the right of Xanax, we got an example of some heroin there, along with some capsules of MDMA, which is a pure form of ecstasy. And then I got a bottle of ZQuil there as well. So when we talk about drug abuse, we're talking about prescription drugs, we're talking about over-the-counter drugs, we're talking about alcohol, we're talking about medications that you can pick up from the pharmacy versus, or even over the counter. So lots going on here when it comes to adolescent substance use. So the first drug we'll talk about is marijuana. Now, marijuana is the #1 drug of choice for youth at ACT. However, statistically, it falls to about number 3 statewide, and that would be behind nicotine and alcohol. But marijuana continues to grab the attention both at the federal level as well as with individual states. As many of you are aware, some of the surrounding states that border Kansas now offer either state level legalized marijuana or state level legalized medicinal marijuana. So, and I'm obviously not here to debate whether or not Kansas should or shouldn't legalize THC. Rather I'm here really just to kind of address the impact that adolescent use of THC has on their lives and the lives of others around them and those caring for them as well. So we talk a lot about, the day and the time when it comes to marijuana. And so this slide really has no clinical significance, but it does provide some valuable information for those. I listen to country music, and whether it's a song by Jimmy Buffett or Alan Jackson, they're singing about being 5 o'clock somewhere, or Zach Brown singing about laying in the hot sun and rolling a big fat one. There's a group of potheads talking about 420 and hyping up April 20th. So the drug world has really managed to seep into everyday walks of life. And whether you listen to country music or rap or hip hop or rock music, you've likely sung along with a lot of different song lyrics that glorify drugs, glorify alcohol. And I think I'm almost embarrassed now when my personal children play songs from the 90s and the early 2000s that I used to listen to, and the amount of drug and alcohol and sex references, it's just crazy. So we really see how the music industry also infiltrates kids and their substance use. So the date and time, so we got 420 on here and we got 710. So many of you are likely familiar with, excuse me, the date of 420, which is April 20th. and the prevalence of that. So in Colorado, on April 20th, there's the annual Cannabis Cup competition where they basically compete to see who has the strongest or most potent form of marijuana. And you'll hear about kids that are smoking up at 4:20 in the afternoon. So 710 is, really a relatively new and not often discussed number. And so with 710, when you flip 710 upside down and flip it around in reverse, it spells out the word oil. And oil is basically, it's an oil-based THC or concentrate. So the picture you see here on the right is an example of a cartridge. You can see kind of like that amber or that thick yellow look to it below the mouthpiece. And below the amber fluid, you see is that 510 threaded piece. And this is what connects to the vape device. So you hear about people carrying around carts, or they're found in possession of a cart. This is basically what they're carrying around with them. It's their own personal product, their own selection of marijuana. And so along with the mouthpiece there with the cart, you see a little container of kind of like a powdered form of marijuana that's like called sift or keef. And then you see a piece of shatter there, or wax. That's the dark brown piece there. And then you see some gel capsules there as well that are a different form of THC concentrates. So here are some examples of cannabis oils and other concentrates, from crumble to crystalline. There's butter, there's shatter, and these are all just different forms of concentrates that vary in different textures and consistencies and potencies. And they also vary with regards to the delivery method. So oftentimes wax, which is kind of like that top right, I guess the third one from the in the middle there. Wax is often used along with shatter and rosin with individualized vape devices. So whether that's a modified bong rig, whether it's a nectar collector, or a vape pen, these are all products that are entered into the device, and then you're able to vaporize the THC concentrate. Okay, so what's important to understand is that, there's a lot of talk about marijuana and people not feeling that marijuana is that bad of a product to have individuals using, but really marijuana has changed since the 60s, 70s. The levels of THC back in those days were about 3 to 4%. And the kids often refer to those low potencies as Reggie or swag, meaning basically like a regular level of THC. And traditional marijuana in Kansas is now starting to reach closer to 30%. So the closer you go really to the Colorado border, whether you're like in an area like Dodge City or Garden City, Hayes, Kansas, you're starting to see higher potencies of marijuana out there. And concentrates, so when we talk about the butters and the waxes, we're talking levels of 60, 70, 80, and upwards of 90% THC. And many of these concentrates are made with butane or CO2. And so it's those concentrates that are labeled BHO. That's what that stands for, is the butane hash oil. Something else that was going on with marijuana that maybe some of you have been hearing more and more about is Delta 8. Now, many of you understand that Delta 9 is the most common form of marijuana that's used around these areas. It has a higher potency, and the concentrates are higher in THC, and obviously Delta 9 is federally illegal, and it's the Delta 9 that has the psychedelic type of approach, the stuff that gets you high. Well, now Delta 8 is a new product. Well, it's not new. It's a product that's being utilized nowadays in Johnson County, and we're seeing and hearing more about teens using Delta 8 gummies. And what Delta 8 basically is, it's a lower grade THC derivative. It's extracted from hemp. And yes, it is lower in potency, but it still provides kind of that same sought after euphoric or happiness or mild sedation that a user is looking for. So when it comes down to, is Delta 8 legal? The answer is, from what I'm coming up with right now, it's kind of, sort of, but not really. We're taking a closer look at what the law says about Delta 8. And so if you aren't familiar with Delta 8 with regards to the Farm Bill, so in 2018, the federal government passed, or I guess Congress passed, the legalization of hemp in the United States. And what this did was this allowed folks to grow and cultivate and hemp. And as long as that hemp stayed below 0.3% Delta-9 THC, they were able to grow this product and sell it. So with that being said, in August of 2020, they introduced what's called the interim final rule, which basically was taking a closer look at, does this product fall under a Schedule I substance? And that final rule was supposed to expire on October 31st of this year. However, they've since extended that now to December of 2022. So we're now on, I think it was December 2nd, actually, the Kansas Attorney General sent out a report on Delta-8 and really kind of identifying what Delta-8 is and whether or not it is illegal or unlawful to possess. And so really what it's all come down to is any Delta-8 that has less than 0.3% THC and it is derived from a lawful form of hemp is legal. However, what we're finding with the cases of Delta-8 around here, with whether they're gummies or different products, they're really not falling within that legal standpoint. And there are state laws regarding the possession and selling of Schedule I products. So in theory, from what I'm understanding from the DA and from the Attorney General, is that Delta-8 is technically illegal in our parts. So a lot more needs to come about with regards to the understanding of how the courts and how probation officers and law enforcement will enforce the Delta-8 variant with regards to Delta-9 and marijuana being a Schedule I drug. So in the bottom slide here, it says this does include gummies. And so the Food and Drug Administration has found that any type of food product that contains THC or even CBD is considered unlawful to possess or sell. And that also includes some of the dietary supplements. So I know that sounds like a whole lot of information because we're still learning more about it, but we're getting more and more kids that are using Delta-8 as opposed to Delta-9. And so this screenshot here kind of helps explain a little bit about what we're seeing when it comes to kids and their UAs that they're providing. And the numbers kind of stay stagnant a little bit. You see that they jump from around 73 to 64 to 78 to 86. And when officers are looking at that far right number, they're trying to determine whether or not this kid is actively using marijuana. But because Delta-8 doesn't register quite as high, we're finding more and more kids are trying to replace their marijuana use of Delta-9 with Delta-8. So lots going on there legally with what we're learning about what kids are using. And I can tell you that I was driving down Santa Fe in K7 the other day, and there's a gas station that's selling, that's got a big neon sign that says, "We sell Delta-8 here." So it's available, kids are using it, and they're trying to bypass any legal system involvement. One thing, let's kind of jump into some mental health correlations with marijuana use, and that is Australia has completed a 4-year study looking at pain management with marijuana. And ultimately what they found is that those who are using marijuana to manage their pain are finding that it's too weak to provide any relief. And so oftentimes they resort to using opioids years later. And there was a study in 2017 from the Journal of Psychiatry that found that those who are using cannabis are 3 times more likely to be users of opioids 3 years later. So we are starting to see more and more folks that were originally using marijuana to cope with whether it's anxiety, depression, or pain management. They're using opioids now instead.
Are you listening to the same thing?
So we also see that
I think she's training. She's
another
doing
study,
it.
the
I'm
2017 National Academy of Medicine identified that the
Well,
regular use of
I wanted to give you that.
cannabis
Thank you for everything.
greatly increases
You have been,
the risk for
like I
psychosis.
just told Nina.
Can we have
there,
everyone make
because
sure that you're muted,
thanks.
please? Thank
Doing
you.
all
Wait
the
a
hard work,
second.
and you've got a lot. Of hard
So
work
do
that
you.
you're
You have
dedicated
that
to it.
times 27,000. I won't know what he's saying about. I'm like, I gotta listen to this. I feel like everything.
All right, there we go.
For you to participate in.
Yeah,
So
so I've
that is
been
so funny.
driving
If we
and
can get that
listening. Yeah.
Trying.
It's a good one. I'm kind of listening.
Christy, are you able to mute them?
I think I did just now.
Okay, thank you. So the 2017 National Academy of Medicine also identified that high potency cannabis, so they're looking at 30% and higher, increase the risk of psychosis in individuals, as well as the anxiety disorders as well. So, and then there's another article in 2019 on depression and anxiety, and it too looks at the correlation between the suicidal ideation and the completion of suicide by those patients with PTSD that were utilizing medical marijuana. So the more and more research that they're attempting to do with regards to psychosis, high potency marijuana, and the impact of the brain, we're continuing to learn more and more about those harmful consequences. Okay, let's see here. So I guess before I jump into the opioids, some general information on genetics. We talk about predispositions to having substance use disorders, but also we know that the impact of drugs and alcohol on the brain chemistry, and really looking at the human genome. And we know that we have, our body consists of DNA and chromosomes and different genes. We approximately have about 20 to 30,000 different genes and 23 chromosome pairs and 3 billion DNA base pairs. So when we talk about the impact of marijuana on psychosis, they have been able to kind of target down or identify that there is a specific gene. It's the AKT1 gene, and it's been found to be most closely associated with individuals who have psychosis and the use of high potency marijuana. But really what it comes down to is how does an individual know if they possess that gene, and what is the likelihood that they too could come down with psychosis due to their substance use. Okay, well, so we'll jump into some opioid conversations. So the United States does have an opioid problem, and for many years I was saying Johnson County, we don't have an opioid problem here, but we're starting to see increasing numbers of overdoses and deaths both nationwide as well as even in our local communities. And I know that efforts are being made to funnel a lot of additional cash into prevention and treatment arenas. However, the potencies of these medications that are hitting the market continues to just raise so many red flags and a lot of concerns for health and safety, as well as the livelihood of many clients that we serve. So just kind of taking some quick look at some facts here. This slide is providing some information on opioids and the opioid pandemic. So opioids are a class of drugs that are naturally found in opium in the poppy plant. And so some prescription opioids are made of the plant directly, while others are manufactured in labs, and they do contain some similar molecular structure. So they're often used as medicines that contain chemicals that will help relax the body and provide some pain relief. So back in 1999, nearly 500,000 people have died since the opioid pandemic, or there's been a couple of waves of it. The first one being in the 90s, and that was with prescription drugs. The second wave was in 2010 with the increase in heroin and availability in the United States. And then the third one was really with started in 2013, which we're basically in right now, and that is the rise in production of synthetic opioids. And most specifically, we're talking about fentanyl, as we're seeing in our local communities. So I think it's important to understand that there are different classes of opioids, or I guess, the first class would be that morphine. And morphine is a Schedule II drug. So, and when we talk about scheduling of drugs, we're talking about whether or not the federal government has determined its use or its potential for misuse and dependence, and whether or not it has any type of medicinal qualities to it. So morphine is naturally occurring. It's derived from the poppy plant. It does provide some alleviation of pain and physical ailments, and it is a Schedule II drug. The next class of drugs would be the heroin, and it's processed from morphine, but heroin is identified as a Schedule I substance, which means that the federal government has determined that it has no acceptable medical use, and its use is often in the United States. Oftentimes, heroin comes from an unregulated market. Then the next class would be oxycodone and hydrocodone, and these are a semi-synthetic opioid, and they're derived from the poppy plant. The chemical structure is very similar to morphine, and they are also used to treat acute and chronic pain. But unlike heroin, the production of oxys and Percocets they're all regulated. So, which means basically that the consistency of the effects from one dose to the next is relatively the same. So in oxycodone, it's a controlled release. So it's a gradual release of medication over time. And both oxycodone and hydrocodone are Schedule II drugs. So again, that means that they've been identified as having medicinal qualities. And the two other ones, so fentanyl is one of the most powerful opioids that we're seeing right now. It is an opioid-based painkiller. It's used to treat chronic pain. And it was developed for those individuals who have developed resistance to some of those less powerful drugs like morphine or oxycodone. And the effects are, it takes a much lower dose than other opioids for this to become effective. So its non-medical use is a little riskier due to its potential for abuse. But like morphine, fentanyl is technically a Schedule II substance. So it is approved for medicinal use in the United States. And the last one is methadone, and which is an opioid that's been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration, and that is used to treat opioid dependence. So the methadone acts on the same receptor sites in the brain to provide relief of symptoms. Okay, so some quick data here. So nationwide, nearly 71,000 opioid overdoses have occurred since 2019, which is about 5% higher than, this was from 2019, sorry. And of those 71,000 deaths, 73,000 were a result of synthetic opioids. So basically 58,000 deaths were the result of synthetic opioids like fentanyl. And Kansas specific in 2018, there were 50 drug overdoses due to synthetic opioids. And in 2019, it was 75. I don't currently have the most recent up-to-date data on Kansas substance use deaths. But as we look at it with regards to kind of some state-by-state comparisons, in 2018, Kansas's 50 deaths was compared to Missouri's 868. And in 2019, 75 versus 886. So we had an increase of about 65%, whereas Missouri had a very slight increase of 0.7%. And when we look at Kansas, they identify Kansas as being a stable and non-significant problem with opioids, but which obviously one death is one too many, but they don't see any significant statistics with us with regards to the amount of overdose deaths that are occurring, but they do report that we have good reporting coming out of our state with regards to those numbers too. I went up and before I jump into the fentanyl piece here, I did look up some of the other states, some of the neighboring states. So like Iowa's 102 deaths in 2019, Arkansas was 113, Oklahoma was 81, and Nebraska was 27. So they were relatively the same as us with regards to kind of being that Midwestern states, but then states like Ohio, Florida, New York, and New Jersey, they were anywhere from 3,000 to 2,800 to 2,500. So some of those other states closer to, like the East Coast really have a severe opioid problem. All right, so let's talk about fentanyl. So as I brought up earlier, the fentanyl pills that have the M30 on them are what we see locally here with some of the kids that have been using, but we also see it statewide because my residential program has kids from across the state. They too talk about the M30 pills. So but we're hearing more and more about the rise of fentanyl, with the most common being these M30 pills. The pictures to the right kind of provided an example of what an overdose sample would look like. So between heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil, it takes less and less of these substances to create an overdose or a death. And carfentanil is technically an animal tranquilizer, so it's not really used for humans. But fentanyl is a drug that's oftentimes mixed with these prescription drugs like oxycodone or Percocets. The circle on the right, I'm going to assume that most of you are not drug dealers or make your own drugs. So the circle on the right with all the red dots, what this really is kind of taking a closer look at why all these counterfeit pills are so different from each other. And if you had a sampling of drug and all the red dots represented the mixture of fentanyl or cutting fentanyl in with this product, it's really, there's no regulation to these drugs. So it's really difficult to say whether one pill, whether it was the bottom left corner there that had 2 specks of fentanyl, how that would be mixed differently than the one in the top left corner that has several specks. So when a user uses their first pill of oxy with fentanyl in it, they may not have an overdose on this product. So then they use a second pill and the result is just so much more different for them. So the first one they tried didn't have any negative effects. And then the second one results in an overdose and a death. So, so as I talked about earlier, that opioids inhibit pain signals and allow the brain to produce more dopamine. It's these high dosages of fentanyl that basically they'll hijack the brain and the whole system. And so when we talk about an opioid, we talk about drugs being fat soluble or water soluble. And so a fat soluble drug passes through the brain barrier a lot easier than a water soluble drug. And morphine and heroin are known as fat soluble drugs. So, but they also have a water base to them. So the absorption into the brain is a lot slower, where fentanyl is extremely fat soluble and it enters into the brain much quicker. So when law enforcement, come up on a passenger vehicle or someone in their car and they find them passed out, overdosing on fentanyl, they use what's called Narcan or naloxone, and this is basically like a nasal inhalant that they can it's a prescription that they can spray up their nose and it'll pull them out of this overdose. And most recently law enforcement have been talking about that it takes more than 1 dosage of naloxone or Narcan to get someone to come out of their overdose. But really when I talk about fentanyl hijacking the brain, it's what it does is it tells the brain to stop detecting CO2 in the body, which results in a person to stop their breathing. So you see a lot of overdoses as a result of this. And I can tell you that kids coming out of ACT, I would almost rate it as about 80% of the kids that we're getting now have been abusing fentanyl. And to see them withdraw from these products, they're experiencing diarrhea and vomiting and nausea, body aches, they can't sleep, they can't eat. They have basically like a restless leg syndrome. They can't lay still in bed. So we're seeing 16, 17, 18-year-olds experiencing high rates of withdrawal symptoms as a result of coming down off of fentanyl. Another drug that's highly abused in Johnson County is Xanax. And Xanax is a benzodiazepine. And so it continues to be pretty popular with kids. There's a lot of names that they go by, whether it's bars or green hulks. So you see the yellow Xanax here, that's known as the school bus. The green ones are known as the green hulks. And then the white ones are often referred to as sticks or ladders. And so basically the color is dependent upon who the pharmaceutical maker is of this drug. And these are 2 milligram bars. And you can see that they kind of have some lines on them. And then those lines help kind of break them up into whether you want to do 1 milligram or a half milligram. That's how they are able to utilize Xanax pills. So it's oftentimes referred to as a sedative. And so Xanax is a class of drugs known as benzodiazepines or a minor tranquilizer or anxiolytic. So Xanax is considered to be a Schedule IV drug. It does have medicinal properties. It's identified as having a low potential for abuse. However, these drugs get abused all the time by kids. And they kind of serve to kind of slow down the heart rate, lower your blood pressure, lowers the body temperature. And basically what this does is the medication is used to reduce anxiety and stress and panic attacks. So I've seen tolerance develop pretty quickly. So it's taking more and more of the substance for them to get high. And a lot of times when we're talking about kids using Xanax, they're using anywhere from 2 to 6 milligrams per use or 1 to 3 bars. And they said that the effects of these individual bars will last anywhere from about 2 to 6 hours with some lingering effects the next day as well. So it is very important that individuals don't mix benzodiazepines with alcohol because that too can be rather fatal. And withdrawal symptoms can be pretty severe. So anytime someone's coming off of a benzodiazepine or even alcohol, those need to be monitored from medical perspective as well, whether it's a detox center or a hospital, because there is a potential for once they are coming down off of these drugs for everything to rebound. And when the brain starts to rebound, whether it's, it sends a message to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, a lot of bad things can happen. So that's why it's important to be medically monitored when coming down off of Xanax as a prescription drug. Over-the-counter medications. So these are also a very popular substance that are abused by kids. Robitussin, Delsum, Mucinex, Coricidin, ZQuil. Coricidin seems to be one of the more popular brands or types of over-the-counter drugs that they use. An average user will use anywhere from about 8 to 16 pills. And, a recommended dosage is typically 1 to 2 pills every 4 hours. And then you can see on here that says severe cases. I've had a few kids that have come through that are using anywhere from 40 to 60 pills at a time. And this is when parents are finding these empty boxes or empty bottles of Robitussin in their room or in their closet or underneath their bed. So they're easy to steal from, whether it's from Walmart or individual pharmacies. And many of you, when you want to know like why they're using the over-the-counter drugs, it's the dextromethorphan. So they're really going for that kind of that drunk hallucinogenic type of feeling. And if you've ever had a head cold, or if you ever had sinus pressure and you took these cold medications, and after about 4 hours, you start to feel the symptoms returning, you get a person who will take 1 or 2 more pills, at that 3 or 4 hour mark, and then they kind of get that medicine head feeling. Their legs kind of get a little wobbly underneath them. So that's really kind of the effect that they're looking for. When it comes to the ZQuil, kids often, it's referred to as stacking, that they'll take ZQuil along with Xanax. And it's kind of like that, the ability to overcome falling asleep while on Xanax. So ZQuil, they refer to it as being non-habit forming, but it's oftentimes used on top of other drugs as well. Again, I kind of talk about the hallucinogenic effects. A lot of times when you see a kid that's on Coricidin or an over-the-counter drug, if they're in the classroom, a lot of times they have their head down. They're oftentimes very sleepy, and these are just a product that they can take in high dosages, and they're relatively cheap, or they can steal them from stores. So alcohol, as you can probably guess, continues to be kind of a staple of the substance use of adolescents. Underage drinking. I haven't looked at the recent results on the Greenbush studies, but they remain relatively stable. Obviously with COVID-19 and the restrictions and remote learning, alcohol became a lot more readily available to kids as they were in the home. Kids at ACT oftentimes refer to alcohol as probably their number 2 drug of choice. And there's still a debate as to whether it's easier to get alcohol versus marijuana or marijuana versus alcohol. But, oftentimes, like I mentioned earlier in that one picture, consumption is by binge use. They're not drinking to get a tipsy or just to have a social drink. They're oftentimes using to get drunk, with hard alcohol being the preferred alcohol of choice over beer. A lot of effort goes into underage drinking and stopping underage drinking. I think we've made some pretty good strides in that effort, but it's really kind of coming down to educating adults and parents of the impact that early alcohol use can have on an adolescent as well. Let's see here. So I'm going to kind of finish up here with some vaping information. So when we talk about the next generation smoker, this is kind of where we've landed. So the next generation smoker, it's not a tough looking cowboy that's lighting up a cigarette that's been, mending fences or herding cattle. We're talking about 12-year-old kids who are taking a hit off of a pineapple lemonade puff bar that their friend was using at the bus stop. So, as I mentioned earlier, the age of first use is getting younger and younger. The nicotine content is getting higher and higher, and the accessibility of these products is getting easier and easier for them to get their hands on. So the progression of use from nicotine to marijuana, and now obviously seeing kids start to use pills and alcohol, it's getting scarier and scarier as well. So when we talk about vaping, it's undergone quite a few transformations throughout the years. The first generation was called the cartomizer, and it's there in the middle of your screen. It was kind of that preloaded, pre-charged vape device. It came with the content in it was what it was, so it didn't vary in flavors. The next generation was the clearomizer, and this was the first tanking system. So basically you poured your solution into the tanking system. There was a cotton wicking system along with a battery that would heat everything up. And then you were able to swap out the different types of fluids you wanted to use, what kind of potencies you wanted to have, and you could change it throughout the day. Then the generation 3 was the atomizer, and the atomizer was the first dripping technique product. And so the atomizer, you'd actually drip the product on top, and then you were able to swap out the flavors. And these were used for the cloud chasing competitions and for different vape tricks. So it was just a different way of using e-cigarettes. The puff bar, that's over there on the far right-hand side. It came after the Juul device, and you kind of see the Juul device down on the bottom. So Juul was first introduced as a flash drive cartridge device. And basically Juul has kind of turned into the Facebook for adolescents, that they no longer really use Juuls much because parents know about them. But what happened was the FDA kind of cracked down on Juul and limited what types of flavors they could be selling. And so they were no longer able to sell off like creme brulee and fruit medley. So any of these cartridge devices or these pod systems had to move to tobacco flavored or menthol flavored. So Puff Bar, what they did was, rather than having a cartridge, they created a disposable product. And because they created a disposable product, they were still able to sell all these wonderful different types of flavors, such as peach ice and cucumber and pineapple lemonade and cafe latte and sour apple. So all these fun flavors, because they were able to sell them as a disposable device and no longer as a cartridge. You see a device there that looks like an asthmatic inhaler. And that was the first forced air inhaler e-cigarette. And yes, it does resemble that of like an asthmatic inhaler. So what you do is you turn it on, it has a battery, it has an internal fan, and then you're able to take a hit off of the vaporizer that looks like an inhaler. You also see a picture here of one that looks like a key fob that has the O2 on it. That's just another discrete vape device that can hook onto your keychain. The middle picture there, you have some box mods, and those are some devices that are obviously, they kind of have like a little computer chip to them, or a handheld device that can Bluetooth compatibility. You can control the amount of heat production, and you can also monitor how much you've used throughout the day. In the bottom below the key fob, you have what looks like an Apple Watch device, and that's also a vape device. You just pop it out of the container, out of the wristband. You can take a hit off of it and put it back on your wrist. And then on the far left side, you have what's called vapeware, and that is a hoodie that the drawstrings are the mouthpiece as well as the container of solution. So all these are just different types of devices that were identified as ways to vape nicotine throughout the day, and some of them are discreet enough so that a user could use them whether they're at school or at a concert or in a movie theater, wherever they may be. So what other issues, or not issues, but what other products I can bring up are what's called RDAs versus RTAs. And if you hear folks talking about RDAs, they're talking about a rebuildable dripping atomizer, or an RTA, which is known as a rebuildable tank atomizer. And so really what these really are is whether it's a dripping device that you drop the solution down the chimney of the e-cigarette, or if it's a tanking system that basically feeds itself. There's another product out there, it's called a squonk mod, and basically it has a bladder inside, and it looks a lot like a box mod, and you can just kind of squeeze that bladder. It sends the juice up into the mouthpiece, and you're able to control how much you use. So if you hear people talk about squonking, that's what they're talking about with regards to their e-cigarette use. So we often talk about, e-cigarettes were designed to be what was identified as a smoking cessation device. And I'm sure it has worked for many individuals, for adults who are trying to come off of traditional combustible cigarettes. But for adolescents, it's really more of a device that they can do tricks with, and then also getting the rush of nicotine without, you know, the harmful consequences of tar. So I want to show you part of this video, just to kind of talk about what the appeal is of nicotine in vape devices. All right, so I'll pause it there. So whether they're doing vape tricks or cloud chasing competitions, you know, they can obtain sponsorship. So all these are, you know, in the spirit of smoking cessation with these products, but obviously kids are using them to perform tricks. So in the first minute or so of this video that I just showed you, the young man on this video took 12 hits off of his device. So 12 hits in every 60 seconds. They're inhaling high levels of nicotine, along with other dangerous types of chemicals. And with every hit, with every cartridge, every disposable device, you know, they're taking more and more nicotine in than really what was prescribed for a person. So a lot of these products have about 5% nicotine, which is double that of what's allowed in the European market. So, you know, this continued perception of adolescents is that vaping is safer than a combustible cigarette. It doesn't contain tobacco, it doesn't contain tar. And so really what you're finding is, you know, school districts across the district or across Johnson County and even the state, they've really had to kind of go back and alter and really take a closer look at their tobacco and drug policies, obviously to capture some of the language associated with electronic nicotine devices. And I can tell you that a lot of the Johnson County districts around here really are looking at what they need to do to be combating nicotine use and drug abuse with kids. So one area I can tell you for Johnson County wide is with a couple of the school districts, the partnership between Johnson County Mental Health and the individual districts to provide drug and alcohol counseling and assessments. And so anytime a youth or a student is suspended from school, whether that be for a possession of a product or using a product, or if they have suspicion of them using, the school district has contracted with us that we'll provide that assessment and provide some guidance to those kids so that they can get the help that they need and some of the support that they require. So when it comes to some of the supportive services in Johnson County, there's a wide variety of different agencies in Johnson County that provide drug and alcohol counseling. Johnson County specific though, for what I manage, both the outpatient and the residential program, AOAS is our Adolescent Outpatient Addiction Services. And so we accept, Medicaid. We have grant funding available for individuals who meet the state requirement for family size and income. And then we also have the sliding fee scale for Johnson County families. And we do take private insurance and self-pay, but really what we're looking to do with my outpatient program, we provide individual, group, family counseling, along with case management services. So many of our youth that are involved with court services and corrections are required to engage in some type of outpatient services. So we have a lot of youth that come to us with those services. And then the residential program, ACT, is currently the only residential program in the state of Kansas for kids needing drug and alcohol treatment. So my program has kids from Wichita, from Johnson County, from Wyandotte County, from all over the state of Kansas that are receiving services for their substance use and mental health needs. So there are some additional programs throughout Johnson County that provide some community-based support groups. I know that we've partnered up with the Church of the Resurrection, has a lot of great programming that's available through their church organizations of some support groups and some speakers there. And then there's Cottonwood Springs that's now providing IOP services for adolescents in Johnson County as well. And I think Mir has some services that are still providing services to kids. So I know Cornerstones of Care provides a lot of care for kids. So lots of options in Johnson County area for getting kids into substance use treatment, but also meeting their mental health needs as well. So here again is my information, my direct phone number, my email address. If you ever have any questions or you want to talk about some specific drugs that I didn't talk about today, I'm happy to do so as well. If you're looking for information about getting a student or your son or daughter or somebody that you're working with into drug and alcohol treatment, I'd be happy to kind of point in the right direction. And even if we're not the right agency for you, we will do our best to partner you up and get you into the level of care that those kids need. So we know that obviously the drugs are bad. We all have the responsibility at some level to get kids help that they need so that they're being set up for success. So by all means, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You've got my contact information, and then I will pass it back over to Christy here. And if there's any questions I can answer, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you, Kevin. That was a lot of information. If folks want to go ahead and turn their cameras on so we can see everyone, we've got a few questions. I guess one of my first questions for you, Kevin, would be, thinking along the lines of what are some examples of effective messaging for parents or trusted adults when it comes to talking to teens? Like, I feel like I'm a big dumb nerd to my teenagers, and I don't know what I could say or do that would influence them. So are there things that we can be saying or doing?
So I'm just flat out honest with my personal children. So my kids are 14 and 10, and they know a lot about drugs just because of the work that I do. But I have conversations with them. I ask them, do you have friends that use? Have you ever been any place where people were drinking there? And I provide them that out. I say, if you're ever in a situation where you feel like you need to get away, you call me, you let me know, I'll come get you. But having open and honest conversations with them, because they know about it, whether they're in school or just their social circle of peers talking about it. They're talking about vaping, they're talking about cartridges, they're talking about edibles. So I think it's really more us that are feeling like scared and almost like uninformed. But ask questions, ask them what they know, ask them what they've seen. And in a lot of cases, they'll be pretty honest with you about what's going on around them and with their friends and in school too. So my approach is just really that open and honest conversation. And I'm a big proponent of sitting down at dinner together. And I know we all live busy lives, but sitting down, having conversations, talking with your kids, and creating an avenue where maybe their friends are coming over to your house. So you can kind of monitor things a little bit differently there as well.
What age should we be thinking about starting those conversations?
So like I said, back when I first started this, so like 15, almost 16 years ago, the average age of first use that we were seeing coming through ACT was about 16, 17 years of age. And now we're talking 12. So what once was the population of targeting kids in high school, we've now moved that target population to middle school kids. But really we need to, so my son is in 5th grade, and he came to me the other day and just said, hey, I saw a cart, or he said he saw a pod at the school playground the other day. So he was recognizing vape pods at the playground. And so really it's those elementary age kids that are now being exposed to it as well. They're learning more and more about vape devices, and they're more socially acceptable than a cigarette. So I'd say middle school really should be that target population.
Okay. So a lot of the kind of drugs and the forms of drugs that you shared were new to me. And I guess I have another question just in terms of, is there a resource or a place that we can go where we can kind of stay up to date and know what's going on? Besides maybe our kids could be a resource, but some of those terminologies were new to me.
Sure. So there's a site that I'll often go to. It's called erowid.org. It's EROWID, erowid.org. And it's technically a harm reduction website, but they talk about different substances, and they basically have a vault of different drugs, and they will share pictures of drugs, what the law says, but then also it kind of talks a little bit more about some of the slang terminology, as well as what the height and the down of the drug is. But like I said, it's harm reduction, so it's not going to be giving you any information on how to combat this. Yeah. So there, Christina just put it up there on the screen. It doesn't. It's not like stay away from this. It's like, hey, if you're going to do this, this is what you should do. So, but Erowid does have a lot of information on their vault of different substances.
And then, and I have all my questions that I wrote down while you were talking, but again, thinking about access to drugs and access to alcohol, where are kids getting Xanax? Are they getting that from us and from our medicine cabinets or other people's medicine cabinets? Are there things that we can be doing to make things safer in our own houses?
Yeah, they do steal from home. They do steal from grandma and grandpa, more commonly than mom and dad, because if they go to visit grandparents, they don't typically have their medications locked up as often as maybe mom and dad might. But yeah, I do often encourage families to lock their medications up, don't have them just easily accessible. But really going to drug deals, kids use Snapchat nowadays for doing their drug deals because it's easy, it disappears obviously. And those of you today who work in law enforcement or probation know that a lot of these drug deals going down, a lot of kids that are in detention centers right now are the result of some of these drug deals gone bad through Snapchat. So accessibility is not always the deterrent here, because they can usually get their hands on different kind of prescription medications.
Mm-hmm. And then we had a couple of questions just about opioid deaths. I guess one question is, how are opioid deaths recorded? Like, how do we know that we have an accurate count, or you know what I'm saying? Just in terms of, how do we know that the number that we see is the actual number, or is that somehow larger?
And that I don't know, to be honest with you. I'm sure that, when they're doing, whether it's a pharmacological test on them, if they're doing autopsies, but when they come across an individual, they can kind of see the signs and symptoms of what an overdose would look like. And they're probably doing toxicology reports to determine what the overdose likely was from. So just knowing that, I talk with a doctor from KU, and anytime that they have any type of overdose that appears to be opioid, they're assuming it's fentanyl right now until they can determine otherwise. So that's probably where the numbers are coming from, are the hospitals.
And then it looked like the data that you shared was from 2019. Do we know, just, anecdotally or through any other data, if we saw increases here in Johnson County or in Kansas, like we've kind of seen reported nationally?
Sure, I don't have the numbers on it, but I can tell you anecdotally, we are seeing every kid that comes through ACT right now is talking about fentanyl. And the fact that they're talking about it, never before was it something that kids were talking about. They weren't talking about overdose deaths due to opioid abuse. They always kind of had that Superman complex, that Superman mentality that it wasn't going to happen to them. But now we're getting kids coming in saying, I'm worried about dying. I'm fearful of dying due to fentanyl. So it's readily available. They know about it. They're using it, and they're actually returning to it as well.
Okay. And we just had a question pop up that said, if a child wants assistance, is there a wait time for treatment?
Sure. So with my outpatient program, we can usually, just speaking specifically to Johnson County Mental Health, outpatient, I can usually get them within a week. And that's an assessment within, even like a couple of days, get the assessment completed. And then getting them intaked into our program is most likely within about a week's time. When it comes to the residential care, unfortunately, right now, I only have 10 beds. We've kind of minimized our bed capacity. COVID hit, we moved locations up to the Shawnee location, and we only have 10 beds right now. So unfortunately, right now, I believe our waiting list is close to April. And I do my best to prioritize Johnson County kids. So if I have someone that calls out and says, hey, we're not coming, or we're going to try to do an outpatient, if I get that gap, then I go to my Johnson County list and I pull one of them in because they're easy to get in because they're local. But yeah, right now we are looking at about April as our wait list time to get kids into residential care. So something that we're always cognizant of. We're trying to, obviously we don't want to rush kids through treatment, but we certainly want to make sure that we're getting those who are needing help in as quickly as possible. And that's why if a kid is screened for residential and they're local and we're going to do outpatient, we really try to surround them with the case management, the groups, and the individual therapies. So on any given week, I can be providing a kid about 3 to 4 hours of services.
And then what's the success rate of kids who go through treatment?
So, okay, success is always a difficult thing to categorize here. The rate of kids who successfully complete treatment is about 89% of the kids that come through our program successfully completing treatment. But then when you start to look at what is the success rate of maintaining sobriety, you're probably jumping to around 25% of kids who maintain sobriety beyond 6 months. So a kid might leave treatment, do really well for about 3 to 4 months and return to use. But about 25% of them can remain sober beyond the 6-month mark. And there are often variables involved there, whether they are on probation, they're on house arrest, they're being frequent drug screens, they continue with outpatient services. And the difficult piece with me with my residential program is once they leave me, they go to Dodge City or they go to Hayes, Kansas. They go to different parts of the state that obviously I can't control the level of care that they get and the frequency of care that they get.
And then do you see Jennifer's question here, just in terms of like with the wait time that we know, what can we be doing in the meantime to support?
Right. So if they're not involved with the legal system, so I'd recommend getting them involved in some community-based support groups, whether it's just like some self-help groups. I would highly recommend that you get them into outpatient services. So if you've identified a need for care, you can always call Johnson County Mental Health. They will put you in or contact me and we'll get an assessment done rather quickly. We can make some recommendations for level of care and start getting them seen. If anything, we start doing that foundational piece of helping them identify some of the negative impacts, but providing them some supports. But if they do have some legal system involvement, really communicating with the probation officer and increasing the frequency of their substance use and with their UAs. And then with some of these kids that are in court services, like I said earlier, we've started our juvenile drug treatment program. And what we do there is we meet with the youth and their parent and the DA and the service provider and the probation officer. That's a bi-weekly meeting with the courts and the judge. So kind of wrapping more services around them to help out.
And you said there were also connections through some of the school districts as well.
So the school districts, we've partnered up with school districts to provide the assessments. And so whether, like Shawnee Mission or Blue Valley or DeSoto or Olathe, when they determine that they have a concern with a kid, they will use some of their DAC funds to help support that and get an assessment done on a kid so that we can make some recommendations for them. Okay. But then there are some church organizations that provide a lot of supports as well.
Okay. So before more people drop off, I'm going to put a link here in the chat box, and that's just to a post-event evaluation. It's just a couple of questions that shouldn't take you more than 2 minutes to do. So I'm going to put that in there. Any other questions for Kevin before we wrap up today? Oh, somebody did, Kevin, ask what gabapentin is.
That's like neuropathy. So it's more like kind of like nerve endings, and like it's a pain reliever. It's really cheap but it's not really potent. So you hear a lot, kids refer to it as Gabby, and they'll actually take high level, like lots of those to kind of get that euphoric feeling, kind of a pain reliever. Okay.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating today. And Kevin, thanks so much. So much information. Probably going to keep me awake tonight a little bit, thinking about my own teenagers. But I really appreciate this, and having access to the information, the resources is so important for us in terms of being able to help to address this issue in our county. So thank you so much. And thanks again for everyone. Please do go ahead and take the post-event survey for us. It helps us just in terms of planning our next events and understanding what we did well and what we could improve on. So thanks everyone. Have a great holiday season and stay safe.
See ya. Thank you. Take care.